Testing, 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 testing. We have had a bad connection service, so I need everybody to let me know in the comments if you hear me loud and clear, if everything is working accordingly. Amen. Let me know, chime in, let me know. I am very apologetic about this evening. Very, very powerful word. We talked about tactics on building. We talked about tactics on building. What was that? Proficiently. Tactics on building proficiently. And in our lesson, we talked about there was some doctrine advice, because the text says, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine. That's Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7, verse 24. Jesus says, whoever heareth these sayings of mine. We talked about it being a doctrine advice. A doctrine advice. He says, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine. In other words, you can't listen to any and every doctrine. The doctrine has to be his. The text says, mine. Not only did we see that he gives us some doctrine advice, but he gives us some devoted advice. Verse 24 says, watch this, and doeth them. In other words, he says, when you hear my doctrine, you are devoted to my doctrine. Why? Because you do it. You do it. You're like Nike. You just do it. Not only did we hear about a doctrine advice and a devoted advice, but we talked about him showing us a describing advice. Look what the text says. The text says, I will liken him unto a wise man. He says, if you take my advice, watch this, if you take the words that I'm saying, if you are devoted to my doctrine, he says, I will liken you, or I will describe you as what? Being intellectual, being smart, being proficiently, being excellent. He says, if you listen to my doctrine, if you're devoted to my doctrine, he says, I will describe you, or I will liken you as a wise man. We talked about it's good when Jesus calls you wise, not you calling yourself wise, but when Jesus calls you wise. Then we talked about that there was dependable advice. Dependable advice. Look at the text. The text says, verse 24, which built his house upon a rock. He says, you are dependable if you listen to my advice. If you listen to my doctrine advice, if you listen to my devoted advice, and if you listen to my describing advice, he says, you will be dependable. In other words, I have some dependable advice for you, because the text says, which built his house upon the rock. If you build your house upon the rock, you're definitely dependable. Not only did we talk about dependable advice, but we talked about a drizzle, drowning, and dispersing advice. The text says, verse 25, and the rain descended, drizzled, and the floods came, drowning, and the winds blew, dispersing. He says, if you take my doctrine advice and devoted advice and describing advice, and he says dependable advice, he says, here goes some advice about drizzle, here goes some advice about drowning, and here goes some advice about dispersing. He says, these are tactics on building proficiently. When drizzle hits your life, when drowning hits your life, when things start dispersing in your life, he says, I have some tactics on you building proficiently. Then he talks about, I have some advice about destructing. Look what the text says, verse 25. And beat upon that house. Destruction. With destruction, he says, I have some advice about destruction. When you listen to my doctrine, when you're devoted, he says that you will be dependable, but there will be some drizzle, there will be some drowning, and there will be some dispersing and destruction that will hit your house. But he says, I got good news. Here goes my advice for tactics on building proficiently. He says, you will be victorious. In other words, he says, I have some defeating advice. He says, you won't be defeated. Because the text says, for it was founded upon a rock. It was founded upon a rock. Amen. Amen.